Hi guys, welcome to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host as always, Steve Hall, and I'm welcomed here by Broderick Chavez, the evil genius, who we haven't had on the channel for a while. So this is very exciting, and I know you guys are going to love what we're going to be talking about today, and that is relating to kind of blood work and things like that. But how are you doing, Broderick?
Sir, I am well, and thanks for having me, and thanks to all your listeners for being interested. Thank you.
And you recently had a seminar over in Australia that went down really well, didn't you, Broderick?
I actually am certainly not trying to correct you, but I had a number of seminars in Australia, all of which went down really well. But Sydney was the big one. I had 120, 130 paid attendees, probably about 150 total in attendance. Just a really, really big deal. It was. Of course, my seminar, I was the focus, but it was actually better than that because it was kind of the who's who of fitness in Australia. And so the intermissions were like a big mixer. It was really a good time, far better than I could ever have imagined. It was just one of those kind of perfect storms. I mean, yeah, I'm a celebrity, I'm whatever, but I personally don't really garner that much weight. It was just a perfect storm of timing and people, and it just went crazy, and it was amazing. And then separately, I did another date in Brisbane, which was also very, very well attended, like 50, 60 people. Felt very subsumed after Sydney, but it was actually a really great event. And that event, by the way, was recorded and produced in a professional fashion and is presently for sale by the people who held that event, Flex Success. So there's literally a 5-hour video of my seminars out there. So it was really a big deal. And then I did a number of underground seminars, which it's my particular stock and trade, but and those went down really well. I believe in some other life I was Australian because I really meshed. Like, yeah, we had an awful lot in common. It was good. It was very good.
Amazing. So, and actually, I'll have to go and reach out to, I think it's Rawdon, who ran it partly. So I'll have to reach out to him and get that link, or you'll be able to provide it, and I'll put it in the description box below. So if people are interested, they can go and purchase the videos.
Yeah, the group that's actually vending it is Flex Success. They're a big training group out of Brisbane. Cool. And really good people, and they put a ton of money, ton of effort into preparing the product. It's really, really nice.
Amazing. And I guess the future's bright in terms of seminars and things. So I definitely, guys, if you're interested in Broderick kind of coming to your area, your country, keeping an eye out because he may well be on his way. So I know there's some things in the works with you.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm presently in negotiations with Singapore, South Africa, and UK.
Amazing.
So I'm dealing with 2 or 3 different groups, or they're dealing with me, but one of them I'm going to commit to, and I will be in the UK probably in the fall. Probably, I think at the moment everyone's talking about October-ish. Mm-hmm. So I would expect one way or the other I'll be in the London area in October.
Amazing. Yeah, no, I mean, I'll do my best to be there. I have no reason I wouldn't be, so I'm excited for that personally, and I know it's going to be a great day. And like you said, it's the opportunity to go and meet like-minded people and kind of just talk and connect, and
so much value in that. I don't want to sound old and curmudgeon, although I sincerely am. In the age of the internet, people have forgot that you can actually meet people. You can actually walk up and shake their hand and actually be in the presence of another person. Not everything is social media driven, so it really does have some power and some value. I think it's maybe making a little bit of a comeback, maybe a little bit of a resurgence, the actual meet and greet kind of thing. I'm definitely in favor of that. I like that.
No, I mean, I love it. I go to seminars and things all the time, and I think people undervalue them because they've got the podcasts, they've got the webinars and things, which are great, but it's nothing like meeting people in real life, and you can get the selfie with the evil genius. So anyway,
you know what? I want to tell you a funny story before you even do that, because you brought it up. Way back in April, I was at the Arnold Classic, Columbus, Ohio, and Mike Israetel and company had a big booth there, $20,000-$30,000, setup and just all this stuff. And I'm standing there chatting with Mike, and this guy runs right up, and he just very patiently waits, and he goes, "Ooh, can I please have a picture with you?" And Mike stands up, and the guy comes right over to me and took a picture with me.
Oh, that must have killed
not only was it sincerely one of the funniest things I'd ever been part of, it was absolutely the first time that anyone had actually asked in that capacity to get a picture with me. So it was a very benchmark moment on many levels.
Oh, amazing. It's always strange.
I have that one little tiny one up. I can go up with that one.
Nice. So yes, now we will get into the topic after we've talked about that. But I think that was a good chat anyway. So we're talking about blood work. Obviously,
yes.
The listeners might well know that I got my blood work done through a company called MediChecks, and then I provided this to Broderick because I wanted to get Broderick's kind of expert opinion on this. And I guess that's kind of a good introduction into why people might want to listen to you and how you got your education in this kind of field, because obviously you're not a doctor by any means, but you have a very good eye for blood work and you can help people with this.
Yeah. In not necessarily the right order, but why you should listen, or why you should listen to me. Everybody thinks that you should listen to them, but my wealth of experience is I personally have been using performance enhancing drugs since age 16, not mindlessly, not recklessly, but in complete systematic volition. I knew what I was doing. I knew to some degree what the consequences were, and I knew what the necessary steps to mitigate those consequences. And because of that, I have had blood work a minimum of 2 times a year, as many as 6 for 30 years. So I have been exposed to a staggering volume of blood work just of my own, never mind all the clients that I later took on and measured. So I had an understanding of what exercise should do to blood work, and then I had an understanding of what drugs could potentially do to blood work. I learned an awful lot from then till now, plus an awful lot of other things, environmental and things that can impact blood work that have added. But even initially, even at age 16, I had a pretty strong understanding of what exercise should do to blood work, had a pretty strong understanding of what drugs should do to blood work, and then basically just started cataloging. And I found an awful lot of things, good, bad. I found certain drugs, certain behaviors that didn't agree with me, certain ones that did, just from the consistent cataloging of while I was taking this, this happened. While I was taking this, this didn't happen, and so on. So there's that accumulated experience. Then secondarily, I do have a degree in biology. I do have a minor in chemistry. I have worked in those fields. The concept of stresses and responses within a creature, a species, a population, etc., completely understandable to me. So I have a pretty strong working knowledge. And to some degree, I think people, and I won't say me like I'm the beacon of something, but people like myself, and there are rather a lot of other people like myself that do this sort of thing, I think actually have a superior skill set in terms of validity to athletes than even doctors and nurses, because doctors and nurses rightly and appropriately deal with either normal people or even worse, sick people. Mm-hmm. And we're none of those. We're not sick, and we're possibly even atypical, not normal. So to some degree, I think there's validity in the idea that the skill set I've developed is superior in this realm to even a higher tier professional within specifically, the medical world. So I'm not trying to put myself on a higher pedestal than a doctor. I'm simply saying in regards to this, I think I would listen to me before my doctor. As a matter of fact, I have quite frankly, and that's actually come up. So that's why I think that I can reasonably speak on the subject. And then secondly, probably what should have been addressed first is I'm amazed at the number of people that just don't consider getting blood work. I hear things all the time like, "Well, I don't take drugs. Why would I need blood work?" Yeah. That to me, that's an amazing statement. That's like saying, I don't drive fast. Why should I check my oil? Well, what the fuck? What? Like seriously, that's not like, I don't zoom around. I'm not a racer, so I don't check that. I don't want to be old and curmudgeon, but when I learned to drive, literally part of the driving test was check the oil, walk around, check the tires. Make sure the vehicle is safe to drive. Granted, it's overkill. Nobody really does that. But yet, It's a complicated fucking machine. You're driving 50 miles an hour and the wheel falls off. There's big problems. The human body is no different. Just because you don't do anything to intentionally harm your health doesn't mean there can be a problem lurking in there. And the sheer fact that, I'm not a race car driver, I don't zoom around, is the reason why maybe that problem hasn't come to light yet. Yeah. But that doesn't mean it's not in there. So there's blood work is basically the ultimate physical. It's the measure of your health on an actual chemical level. So the idea that you don't need blood work to me is just laughable. As a person, just anybody, your mother, your neighbor, your mailman, everybody. Then if you tell me with a straight face, I'm an athlete, I'm a performance-driven human being, and then you really still don't have numbers, go fuck yourself. Just go away. I don't even want to talk to you. Like that's like telling me you're dieting, but you don't know how many calories you're eating. Like that is just you're not really. You're just not. Yeah, just so that's I could probably veered off point there a little bit, but that's roughly how I feel about blood work. It's kind of the crux of all of this.
No, I absolutely love the actual analogy, and I think when you put it out in that way, people will be like, I never really thought about like that. And I certainly myself, when I was 16, I was just thinking, when I was 16, I was a clueless, like I had no idea what I was doing. And you were already like on your way. So that just goes to speak to how much experience you have and how much interest and passion you have in the area. And then, completely, I think a lot of the listeners will now be thinking, I should probably get some blood work done. And to make anyone feel better who didn't get any done, like I haven't been regularly getting mine, and I for sure will now, because I do see the value in it, and I think this episode's going to give people that kind of understanding.
And you can testify to this too, is in the realm of sports performance and what things cost, what we pay for gym memberships and potentially supplements and Under Armour t-shirts. Blood work's really not a major expense. I mean, it is really not. If you went whole hog crazy, you might spend $500 a year. In the big picture, that's not a lot of money.
Yeah,
especially for something that could conceivably, one, save you just tragic, outcome, and two, actually improve your performance.
No, 100%. I know my test, I got one of the more advanced ones. It was £150. If you do that twice per year, right. It's not gonna kill the bank or anything. So the amount you spend on probably crappy pre-workouts or things like that in that nature, you can probably put that towards a blood test. Will do you much more favor.
Absolutely. I personally, this is how intellectually savvy I am in terms of economics and economy, but I benchmark everything. I know what I spend on coffee, which is my luxury in the world. So if it doesn't cost me more than my yearly volume of coffee, I consider it fair game. That's my measuring stick. I'm like, I could, even like when it comes to like a thing, like, paying a parking meter or whatever, I go, no, that's a cup of coffee. That's completely reasonable. And I just pay it and I go on my way. That's how clueless I am when it comes to that. But this, on the other hand, I think I have something to offer. So do you have any special idea on how you want to proceed?
The only question I had actually, and this did come up a few times, was when you get the Medi-checks. I don't know how it works or if there's services over in the US different, but they actually use a finger prick type of blood, and then you put it within the container and you send it off, and if it's not good enough quality or whatever, they will make you redo it. But a few people asked, is this as valid a test as within the lab? Can you still use this to a high degree of certainty?
The answer to that is actually both yes and no. It is absolutely not as effective as serum values that are spun and separated from the blood. So taking a vial of blood is always going to be more accurate. It's always going to be more inconvenient and more expensive. So the answer is no, they're not directly comparable. However, that measure of deviation is not large enough to disvalue or defunct them. It's just not as precise. Again, and something I'll actually cover in the actual talking about blood work is, once again, just like taking a body weight measurement or a body fat measurement or even a blood pressure, it's consistency.
Yes.
Figure out where you're going to deal with them, follow the protocols the same way every time, roughly perform everything as consistently as you can, and then you're at least comparing apples to apples. Even if they're slightly spotty apples, it's still apples to apples. And that's the key here. Is I'm not asking everyone to become a biochemist and get a degree in phlebotomy. That's not at all what we're looking for here. But what we're looking for is some reasonably valid datums that we could track this way and that and make better decisions based on them.
No, I love that response. The consistency, I think, then, I mean, it just, a light bulb went in my head where I was like, okay, no, that makes complete sense. So, no, brilliant. And actually, Broderick, if you've got something you want to start with, go for that. And if you don't end up covering something I've got down, then I'll ask away.
Yeah, well, basically what I have is my blood work. It's blood work that I got recently. And just as a point, I have a similar service over here. There's like 6 or 8 of them. My Labs now, Internet Labs, any basically type in blood work labs, you'll get it. The way it works with them is in fact, they generate a prescription, an invoice for the blood work. You pay them, they pay the lab separately, and then you take it into the local lab, LabCorp or one of the others. LabCorp is the biggest in the U.S., and you just present it to them. They know what tests to do, and the results go to the purveyor and then are emailed to you. Oh. So, and it's typically like a 48-hour turnaround. Prices are very comparable to what you had mentioned. Many of them actually even have now, because of the age of rejuvenation and longevity and et cetera, they even have it's like going to a car wash. It's like the super package, the sports package, the hormone package, the menopause package, and each of them has certain validities, and we'll talk about maybe things you would want to make sure you get. Yeah. But in general, I'm just going to go down top to bottom and kind of just highlight what things are and how important they are. And in every seminar I've ever done, I've always disappointed at not being asked this question. So I'm going to start with this. Is the question people should ask me is, what's the first thing you look at when you look at blood work? What is the first thing I go to? And in my mind, the way I do it is I prioritize not dying. Absolutely, not dying is first. Not dying a little later, second, and then performance last. Even though I'm the drug guy and I'm the performance guy, dying really jams up your performance. Okay? Being sick kind of jams up your performance. So we need to get those out of the way. And in order of what's most likely to kill me today, that would be the very first thing you would get in almost part of almost every blood panel. And that's something that would be titled CBC, or possibly CBC with differential. CBC stands for complete blood count. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's going to tell you everything that's in your blood in terms of solids and liquids. Red blood cell count, RBC. I think that one's actually pretty much universally around the globe as far as what it should be. And what you're looking for there is a value south of 50. As you get above 50, blood is beginning to get thicker, and you have a higher tendency for clumping, clotting, blood-based problems. Every blood work has a range. I think the range in the U.S. is, like I said, I think it runs to 50. I think you might actually, you're probably using I'm not sure what measurement the UK uses, so I apologize for that. But again, what you need to do is just simply look at the reference range, and every single tick you're outside of the reference range, above the reference range, that's potentially danger. And then same thing with hemoglobin. Hemoglobin in the US, you typically want a hemoglobin about 16 or 17. Below 17, you're threatening at least athletic-based anemia. Above 17, you're getting into very thick bloods. Now, okay, that's the health side of it. I'll jump slightly and address some performance here. You might be saying, well, I don't take testosterone, so my red blood cell count won't be escalated. You're absolutely right. However, exercise and even momentary health has influence on your red blood cell count. So you can compare what that is reference range-wise, and even better, compare it to what it's been historically. If you know that you're typically, when you're grooving and things are good, you got blood work, and you're hemoglobin was 17, and then you look at it now and it's 18 or 15 or 16, you can make an assumption. If it's high, you can assume that something's different and you've got hormone levels that are driving blood volume. Or if it's low, you can assume that that's probably you're not keeping pace with the level of activity. You're actually making a deeper inroad into your ability to oxygenate and transport oxygen. For instance, Tour de France athletes. Again, I know they're not bodybuilders, I know whatever, but that is the number one thing a Tour de France athlete would monitor, is because as soon as those numbers dip, so does performance. And in the same time, though they want them as high as possible, the minute they get up into the 50s, you have risk of death, of blood clotting. There was a Spanish guy, a famous Tour de France guy from Spain, who was actually in the 80s referred to as Mr. 60, because he literally consistently drove his hematocrit to 60, which is, to me, is stupefying, because I personally have had a hematocrit of 55, and I literally felt like I was underwater. It was so hard. It was horrible. But my point is that is the very first thing I would look at. It's both the most proximal to your health. Even if you had liver stresses, even if you had kidney problems, you won't die today. You get a blood clot, you literally could die before you get to the car. Yeah. So that is the first thing I would look at. And it's also tremendously relevant to your overall performance. A low hematocrit and hemoglobin suggests that you're probably overtraining. A high hematocrit and hemoglobin means you're either potentially doing too much of something or undertraining. And people forget about that. There is such a thing as undertraining, even to a natural. I don't mean to be completely condescending, but there is even that, especially among the high-intensity crowd. You can get to the point where you're training so hard, you're actually not training at all.
Right.
You may be killing it, but 3 sets a week, that might leave some residual. That might leave some leftovers. So that's where I would begin. Then in with the CBC, there's an alphabet soup of numbers. There's MVC, M8, MCH, and so I won't go into all of them, but that is geometry of blood cells. Right. Things like, you wouldn't have this, you would know, but things like sickle cell anemia would show up in there, certain cancers, because they change the geometry of blood cells. But in general, it's nice to know that what they are, and most importantly, it's nice to know they're not significantly changing from blood work to blood work. And then again, the reference range on that sort of stuff is very relevant and sensible. So that's where I would begin always. CBC, blood counts, super valuable. The knowledge of what your red count and hemoglobin is probably is the value of the test. Right away, that's probably the validity of the test. From there, I'll just turn the page and move to the next thing. It just so happens on this particular panel, the next thing is thyroid values.
Right.
Thyroid, T3, T4, and TSH. And I would approach them in the order of TSH first, T3 second, T4. And really the one that I think is most relevant is the TSH, the thyroid stimulating hormone. Typically, that should be around 2. If it's above 2, regardless of what your thyroid values are, it means your thyroid gland is working very hard to generate those numbers. It's getting a lot of stimulation. If that value is very low, say below 2, it means that your thyroid gland is not being stimulated very hard. Again, regardless of what your values are. So I would definitely reference the absolute value. And then most importantly, over time, you would theoretically get blood work at different phases of your training. You should see a different thyroid value while you're overeating as you should when you're undereating, because your thyroid gland should be taking steps to moderate the metabolism differently. So again, knowing that should happen is very valid. So if you're deep in a diet and don't see a suppressed thyroid value, or do, that gives you 2 entirely different bits of information. Okay, if you don't, it means that the diet has not yet closed any feedback loops and really downregulated you, and theoretically you just diet harder. Yeah. Whereas the other side of the coin is if it's very low, you're in a situation now where, of course, eating less will cause you to lose weight, but not at the pace you might have previously expected, because you're losing pharmacological stimulus. And yes, pharmacological is the right word, even though you're not taking it synthetically. Although, again, in my case, I would be, but all of the same rules apply. If that level's suppressed, I'm going to have to step up my dosing. And if that level is not suppressed, I might have to back away. So I would look at TSH first, then T3, then T4. And with the T3 and T4, I wouldn't so much dwell on the value, because the value isn't probably the bigger thing. The two things I would look there is, one, that the value is commensurate to the TSH. If your TSH is to the moon, if your TSH is 7 or 8 or 10 and your thyroid is still low, that means your thyroid's trying really hard but actually not producing.
Okay.
That's a medical condition. That's a medical condition. And believe me, 100 out of 150 people actually have that condition, at least in the athletic terms. Okay. Their thyroid is not performing as well as they think it is. I'm super serious on that. Then second thing I would look at is the conversion. Is ultimately T4 is the jump off point, because your body produces T4 and then you get T3. So again, if T4 is very low, but you have a good T3 value, that's great. Yeah. If T4 is very high and you have a low T3 value, then that moves the problem from your thyroid down to your liver.
Right.
And now you've got liver dysfunction is not converting the thyroid properly. And both of those are relevant. For instance, women, you typically have late life, late onset hypothyroidism. That's typically because of the thyroid gland. Now, on the other side of the coin, alcoholics typically have late onset thyroid dysfunction, and that's because of the liver side. Wow. Their thyroid's doing everything great, but their liver's so beat up, it's not producing the T3 from the T4. And that is actually exactly in my case, a lifetime of pharmacology use has degraded my liver's ability to convert. And now I'm hypothyroid. I am thyroid dependent. And again, it's for that reason, is my liver is not making the T3 out of the T4. Mm-hmm. So again, a lot of information you could pick out here. And let me be clear again, I just want to really reinforce this. It doesn't mean you're sick or you're going to die or you have no potential for sports. It simply means that it's a parameter you're going to have to modulate, just like training volume. I mean, there's that asshole that just do unlimited training volume and recover, and then there's that unfortunate asshole that does 2 sets and are crushingly sore. It's not the end of the world. It's simply you have to modify your behaviors based on that knowledge. Yes. End of story. And I think it's super valuable. Moving on with the blood work, the next thing is BUN. It's basically the amount of nitrogen being released in your urine. There's a problem, again, where my skill set maybe is different and of a higher validity in this realm from a doctor. A doctor sees an elevated BUN, they think you're diabetic. Yeah. Your kidneys aren't working, you're going to die. That's not the case. You lift weights, you do cardio, you are metabolizing protein at a far higher rate than regular people, and therefore you have greater excretion of urea, nitrogen, etc. So what I expect to see with BUN and later creatinine, which is the next thing we'll cover, is I expect to see them elevated, probably top of the reference range. Yep. Okay. Out of the reference range, I would categorize that based on, 1, historically, where have you been? And 2, what did you do right before the blood work? You go, do squat and deadlift and then run and get blood work. Okay, that number's going to be very high. If it was your day off, you went, and then the next day you went and did blood work and it was still out of reference range, I'd say, that's interesting. Let's make sure we come back and look at that. I wouldn't immediately panic because, again, I'm doing this in order of, relevance to death. Beat up kidneys and an elevated BUN is not good. And in the next 4 or 5 years, it's going to settle you down. But it's 3 or 4 years. It's not, dying in a driveway trying to get to the hospital. So, again, it's super valuable information. And even knowing, hey, I have elevated BUN or creatinine, it's not, again, game over. It's simply that now I might have to dial back my training a little bit. I might have to dial back my protein intake a little bit. Right. And that could possibly truncate some results, but that's way better than having a genuine bona fide medical condition later. Mm-hmm. It's just the way it is.
I just wanted to pull up one thing that you said that was really, really important there was you talked about the consistency of taking it and kind of taking it on after a rest day or after a training day. And I think that's just something the listeners should realize that's going to impact things. They should keep that element consistent.
Absolutely. And even then, it's not going to be wholly consistent because even though it may be a day off or even 2 days off or something like that, your overall training volumes might be different. Yeah. Your overall body fat percentage might be different. So there's invariably going to be differences in here. It's not exactly measuring, apples to apples every time, but it's as close as you can get and weeding out the obvious mistakes. I mean, I don't know how many times I've seen somebody, do 10 sets of 10 in a high bar squat, go get their blood work, and they call me and they're like, oh God, my CPK is 3. And I'm like, yes, it is. And yes, it should be. Settle the fuck down. Then the other side of the coin is there's always that one random time where a guy's completely off drugs, he's barely training, and he gets his blood work and he goes, is this bad? And I'm like, yes, that's really bad. Like, draw a big circle around that, put some arrows on it. That's bad. So it is very contextual. But again, you have no context if you don't take the fucking measurement.
Yeah.
That's the key. Take the measurement. Moving down, we have potassium, sodium, those calcium, potassium chloride, all of those things completely relevant and also completely obvious. They are exactly what they are. And believe me when I say that unless you have a real medical condition, those are going to be right in reference range. They're not going to be wrong. Even you personally who have a little bit of trouble with sodium potassium regulation, you were not out of reference range. You were a little off of what I think was ideal. Yeah. And we talked about that, but certainly not out of reference range. If they get out of reference range, you're going to know it. You're going to have your regular heartbeat, ridiculous muscle cramps. You're going to have problems that will take you to a doctor long before this podcast, for sure. So know that. Next thing in that is – the next thing on this particular list is liver enzymes. And I actually wrote it down because I can never remember. I've been doing this my entire life. I can never remember. It's AST and ALT is what they'll say on your blood work. And that stands for aspartate aminotransferase and respectively alanine aminotransferase. And they're basically just two enzymes that your liver generates in response to stresses, things that are stressful on the liver to break down. Now, again, most naturals are immediately going, well, I don't take drugs. That doesn't mean anything. I'm not taking Dianabol. I'm not going to have liver problems. That is abso-fucking-lutely wrong. First and foremost, training has an influence on liver enzymes because, again, your liver is the central bank of your body. All the conversions from fat to energy, from carbohydrates to fat, amino acids, the deamination, the glyconeogenesis, all that stuff's going on in the liver. And the more you make your liver do, the harder you make your liver work, the greater the responses. Add to that the fact that you're eating bunches of food. Potentially some of those could be stressful. You could even have food allergies. Believe me, they stress the liver. There's environmental stresses. There's no limit to the amount of things that are going to have influence on that. Knowing that is the first step. Most people just write it off like, I'm not an alcoholic, I don't have liver problems, or I'm not taking steroids, I don't have liver problems. That's fucking wrong. Most of the people, believe me when I say this is really important, folks. Most of the people in the world dying with liver problems were not taking steroids. Most of them were not alcoholics. Most of them were unfortunate people who have liver problems.
Yeah.
It's a real thing. So again, you can have all the outward appearances of health and have a pretty significant problem bubbling under the surface. And it's a very simple, cheap, and easy test to know you don't, and then also to know later that it's not manifesting. Mm-hmm. So super valuable. Now, I will throw out some kind of quasi-drug advice. There's a reference range for your liver enzymes, and both that reference range is roughly at about 60 and below for both of those values. Not exactly, but approximately. Mm-hmm. My attitude as far as what I think is acceptable for sports, and that is any value I see under 100, I write off as that's the cost of doing business. Right. That's eating a ton of food. That's exposing yourself to high stresses in the gym. That's completely acceptable. Anything 150 or below, I say that's about as high as we want that. Lower would be better, but that's not going to kill you.
Right.
Anything above 150, I say you really ought to stop, put your hands in your pockets, and have a think. Okay? Now, just to give you some relevant context, 300 is about the number you would be put in the hospital. If your doctor saw 300, he'd say, you know what, we need to check you in, get you, all the blood work in the world, find out what's going on. So when I say 150, that's actually pretty conservative, because anything up to 300, like your doctor would send you home at 250, but he would send you home with a note, don't be an asshole. Yeah. Like, whatever you're doing, you need to settle. But it's okay to go home. Anything above 300, he's going to say, we need to find out why this is happening. So just some perspective there as far as what is what. But again, an interesting point. I had a guy who was not a Tour de France caliber biker, but he was a cyclist that did the crazy road races, 100 miles nonsense. And we, just as a goof, got blood work on the 9th day of a 10-day race. So it was right in the mix of things. And I tell you, because I know I was the person handling his everything, he was not momentarily taking drugs. Okay. And his blood work was very good previous to the race. At day 9 of this 10-day race, from nothing other than the stresses of that race, which again, by definition, was ridiculous overtraining. I get it. But my point is, his liver enzymes were in the high 90s from nothing but that activity. Okay, so just to give you some idea of how malleable these numbers are. Now, admittedly, they probably fell down within days after that. They went away quickly, but I'm just pointing out how proximal and responsive these things can be. So it's I'm making it out to be very, very important, but at the same time, I'm saying, but it's probably not going to kill you today, so don't flip out. But again, you can't even have this discussion until you have data. So get the data. Next thing on my particular list, and this is out of order, this is usually at the end, that is lipids. And again, kind of that, I have a car, it has a dipstick analogy. Why wouldn't you check it? Right. We know that coronary heart disease, atherosclerosis, et cetera, we know that's a thing. We know it really kills people. And we also know that there's a measurement for it. Here it is, folks. So your cholesterol should be in reference range. And roughly speaking, I don't want to make it overly childlike, but roughly speaking, the lower your cholesterol is, probably the better your long-term outlook is across the board. And then your LDL HDL ratio, you want the high density to be as high as possible and the low density to be as low as possible. And again, that high as possible is very dependent on your genetics and then also what you do. For instance, I'll give you just out of my blood work. My cholesterol is very, very hard to impact. My cholesterol has been about 200 since age 16. It's gone up and down a few percent. It's been 205. It's been 195. Whether I live on bacon or lettuce or 5 grams of testosterone or no grams of testosterone, my overall cholesterol does not change much at all. Mm-hmm. However, what does change is that as high as possible number, my HDL can go to literally almost zero. I've had HDLs of 1, and it's 1 with the little alligator mouth, which is, it probably isn't even fucking 1, asshole. So, and I'm well aware of that, and I'm also well aware of how not good that is, and I try my hardest to mitigate it. And again, in theme with keeping records, following records, tracking records, I have found that a number of compounds are particularly suppressive to that value, and I avoid them other than when I absolutely need them for specific outcomes. And so even though I am doing a harm to myself, I'm doing the least possible harm, at least in that vector, whenever possible. But again, you couldn't even say that reasonably until you have the blood work, and then until you have 10 blood works, and you can start to make this sort of call. Okay, so again, super valuable. And again, why would you not check your cholesterol? I mean, personally, I think especially countries like you and Australia and places that have kind of the government-driven healthcare, I'm almost of the opinion it should be the law. Like if you have a birth certificate, you should fucking get blood work once a year, and it should be. Yeah. I really think it's that important. Going down the list, we have cholesterol, LDL, HDL. There's like the V and VHDL and all. Just glance at it, know that it's in a reference range. And again, you don't want it changing rapidly. That's the thing you're looking for. Next thing on here is the beginnings of the testosterone, the hormonal panel, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone. I'm sure all of your listeners are pretty familiar. They're the big, test boosting realms. Again, the thing you want there is you want them as low as possible in regards to the testosterone level. That means that your testes, your actual production mechanism, is working efficiently. If you have a high stimulating and follicle level, it means that there's a lot of message to manufacture these hormones and then some sort of downstream problem. So you want those values as low as possible, unless you're doing something specifically to elevate them.
Right.
If you were taking some nutty test booster that you believed to have validity, I won't get into how unlikely that is, but let's say it was the case and you knew that product X should raise your testosterone, that means by definition product X should elevate those two values, because that's how you get elevated testosterone. So to some degree, you could determine the efficacy of a product by its ability to influence those values. Yeah. You see how useful measurement is? Again, that's how science would work. That's how they would set that up in a science. They would take a bunch of animals, they would measure blood levels, they would apply something, wait a given period of time, check blood levels again, and they would theoretically see a change based on the influence of the applied compound. We can do that too. We have that ability. It's like science and everything. It's like, oh, right here. So I get excited. I'm sorry. The next thing on my list is testosterone. That's kind of a no-brainer. Again, you want that to be as high as possible. And more importantly, you want that as consistently as possible. High is great, but not randomly and haphazardly and what have you. I have met a number of again, I don't want to throw you under the bus, but you're a great example. You have a very good physique. You are a prize-winning bodybuilder, and yet you literally have borderline hypotestosteronism. You have very low testosterone levels. Probably not, at least the last blood work, I think maybe not quite treatable, but low.
Yeah.
Okay. So my point is having low testosterone, again, doesn't preclude you from success, but having declining testosterone is absolutely indicating that your progress is going to decline.
Yeah.
So again, monitoring, tracking, predicting based on, if your training volume's to the moon, you might see a suppression in that. But if your training volume is normal or even lower than normal, that value better be normal or above normal. Just like the hematocrit, it's going to track to your total training volume. But again, you can make those assumptions very simple. And you can also start to track, for instance, every time my training volume gets over 150 sets a week, my testosterone declines. That can give you some very relevant parameters. Mm-hmm. And this is the sort of thing that I would definitely track with my clients, is what sort of training thresholds, kind of like Mike Israetel and his training landmarks.
Yeah.
Well, I would equate those landmarks more to what are they doing to your blood work. So again, it's interesting because, again, Mike's a really great guy, and Mike largely builds his models based on naturals, and I largely build my models based on drug use. But at the end of the day, we're actually doing the same things. Yeah. We might have slightly different methodologies to doing it, but we're literally doing the same thing. We're taking this measure of data and that measure of training data, correlating them, and then adjusting based on each.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what Mike would do. It's exactly what you would do. Again, I'm using blood work in milligrams. He's using sets and reps, but it's exactly the same thing. And it's super important that people realize that. Drugs do not turn you into some other species. They just turn all the dials up to 12. And that's, it literally, you don't get a free ride. You just get a much easier ride. So it's important to know that. I think sometimes, I don't mean to be condescending, but I do think that naturals sometimes forget that. They just, I hear that all the time. Like, well, if I took what he took, I'd be successful too. And I'm like, that's a fucking stretch. Yeah. That's a fucking stretch. I don't know if that's true. But anyway, I don't mean to make that argument or start that argument. The next thing on here is the prostate values. Again, pretty obvious. You want them as low as possible. Non-existent's great. You don't want prostate issues. Again, behaviors can influence that, and then going back to testosterone values can affect that. Right. So if your testosterone, for reasons whether you're taking it or you're changing your training volumes, and your testosterone goes up, you would almost certainly see a minor elevation also in those values, because they're correlated, because they're generated by the same basic hormone cascade. So again, you should know that, and then you can see the requisite changes. Next thing on here is IGF-1. That's abnormal. Most blood work does not involve IGF-1. Okay. Quite honestly, I don't love IGF-1 as a blood test under these contexts, because it is super, super malleable based on behavior.
Okay.
How much and what you ate the day before the test, how hydrated you are, can radically have that. Again, it's not really your target audience, but you'll see a lot of purveyors of growth hormone saying that we did a plasma test and it had this value, and what they're not telling you is a lot of times just your sheer behavior can generate that value. Drug be damned. If you happen to eat a bunch of high glycemic carbohydrates in a high estrogen environment with no training, you're going to get a very big IGF-1 response regardless. It's not, so there's a lot to that. And then the same thing can actually happen is you can have pharmaceutical off-the-shelf best growth hormone in the universe, but if you were ketogenic and overtrained with low estrogen and you take it, you'll get almost dick for IGF-1. Wow. Absolutely. So it's not nearly as simple as that. I realize, again, not your target audience, but I'm pointing out that with the validity of this, there's also pretty deep caveats, and it's again why you might want to consult somebody like myself that has that kind of experience, because you could make a very big deal out of something and not realize, oh, but that's actually what should have happened because of X, Y, and Z. Next thing on here is vitamin D. That's kind of the new craze. I used to actually not really get super wound up about it. You also sometimes in place of vitamin D, it'll say 25 hydroxy.
Okay. Yeah.
Which is sometimes they're interchangeable. Well, they are interchangeable. It depends on who's doing the blood work. Mine very specifically says vitamin D, and that's usually in nanograms per deciliter. And according to this, I was low this particular time. The reference range tends to run to 100. Again, for athletes, I find north of 100 to be a really good value. Personally, I actually strive for 200. I never quite make it. I typically strive for. And to get that value of 200, literally I need 10,000, 15,000 IUs of vitamin D a day, plus some sun. I literally do. And it's interesting, if you track this, you'll find your values go up in the summer and down in the winter, which is again exactly what should happen because you're going outside. And again, it's verification that things are working and that nature's doing what it's supposed to do. It's super useful. Next thing on here is C-reactive protein, which is again a diabetic / inflammatory marker. Again, you want that as low as possible. 1 is usually the ideal number. Lower is better. Then we're at a very interesting part, and this is one that you and I focused on a lot: estrogen.
Right. Yes.
Estrogen, estradiol, E2. There's a number of ways it can be worded. And again, people panic when they see a high number. The high or lowness of that number isn't the immediate concern. The thing you want is A, consistency, and 2, a good corollary between your testosterone. For instance, if you had high testosterone and high estrogen, no foul. That's really not a problem. If you had high testosterone and low estrogen, that's interesting, but not really a foul. Okay. However, if you had low testosterone and high estrogen, that would be a foul. Now you have to wonder, why am I underproducing mood hormone but overproducing the downstream hormone? That suggests, 1, you either have some sort of behavioral issue that's metabolizing or utilizing all of your testosterone inappropriately or inappropriate to your task anyway, or you have some sort of production problem. And either of those is – and there's also the potential for that mineral binding globulin issue, but I won't go into that because it's a huge, complicated subject. But my point is knowing the comparison of those two values could tell you an awful lot about what's going on under the hood. Mm-hmm. And then seeing that track over time, very, very valuable. And again, even though, quote, as a natural, you probably don't have much ability to control it, you have two abilities. One, to know what it is, and two, to eliminate behaviors that fuck it up.
Yeah.
That's the number one thing that you have, whereas I have the ability to just blatantly manipulate it. I can just stick some hormones in there and change it. But you are relegated to the scenario where, okay, I can't raise it, but I can do everything in my power not to depress it. And that's, again, anti-catabolism is as valuable as anabolism. Not going backwards is at least not going backwards. So super valuable there. And things in the estrogen realm, you can then start to correlate to sex drive, even fertility. So it's very, very valuable. And then again, if you're keeping records the way I would coach an athlete to do, and you're keeping track of things like, it's kind of weird to say out loud, but, tracking things like morning erections, which I think is a huge data, and then comparing that over time to your expected estrogen outcomes, you can start to see the, quote, sweet spot and things of that nature. Yeah, super valuable stuff. Super valuable stuff, folks. And then also you should see your estrogen value go up when you're fatter and down when you're leaner, regardless of what your testosterone value is, because the enzyme that converts testosterone into estrogen is manufactured in fat tissue, in adipose tissue. So the higher the volume of adipose tissue, the higher the reservoir of that aromatase enzyme you have. Again, super, super valuable information. And it can also, lead you to conclusions that, things are going the way you think they are under the hood, or they're not. So super valuable. That is the extent of what I have on this particular blood work. There are lots of other things. You might have white counts, things. And again, we won't go into the specific, there's I can't even, lymphocytes, monocytes, etc. I won't go into them, but knowing white count is basically your immune response. And again, that's super valuable, especially to the natural crowd. A little less to drug users, interestingly, because we know the drugs are going to piss off our immune system. Every time you're administering something, we just know there's going to be an elevation, right. And there is. The problem with that is now the lens is not as focused, and when we happen to eat nuts or whatever that is in fact generating a mild allergic response, we're not seeing it because we're already seeing that elevation. Whereas a true natural can see pretty significant spikes in relation to problematic foods, problematic behaviors. And again, that you wouldn't believe how valuable that is. I spent some time working with some of the athletes at the Olympic headquarters and that caliber of athletes. And one of the major things they do once a year is allergy panels, because over time, that small exposure, if you have a problem with, I don't know, just make some peanuts, and you eat peanuts once a week, that's once a week making an inroad into your immune system that could ultimately collectively add up to, a respiratory infection because of your training volume or or something. And it's so, I don't want to say easy. It's not easy to weed it out, but it is in fact elucidatable with simple blood work and an understanding that the things you put in your mouth and the behaviors you engage in are going to have effects, and then measure them and make rational decisions based on those measurements. And that's at least the short version of my song and dance. What more is on your mind? I'll talk forever. I love this shit.
No, I mean, I love it as well. And
is where I live.
I think, to be honest, because we've been talking for almost an hour live on the podcast, I think we can probably get a good amount of questions coming from this kind of general summary that we've got here. Because I have some questions, but I don't want to kind of make this into the longest episode ever. And I think we can actually get some good questions from the audience, from the things you've touched on. And I think you just made some great points. I think it's very much like sleep's becoming very popular now, and people are realizing, oh, if I have rubbish sleep, this and this happens. And it's now, well, people are going to start getting their blood work, and they're like, well, I can relate these things like you talked about, like the libido, or they get the cramping. Absolutely. And they can see they have things, they can actually make some efficacious changes. The only question I had that I thought might be nice to kind of finish on is there any common things that you see when you do look at people's blood panels that it's like, that's an easy thing that you could just be changing? I know when we had it, you're like, you could just increase your sodium a little bit, eat some beef, things like this. That was very easy for me to do. And I think it might be nice for listeners to hear that.
Quite honestly, the two most immediate and almost universal is exactly that. Athletes have a strong tendency to underconsume sodium, and because of that, their sodium, potassium, calcium levels are all suppressed. Calcium is the really important one, especially as you age. And interestingly, the way to raise your calcium is not raise your calcium, but to raise your sodium. Then your kidneys do their magic voodoo that they do and actually elevate the retention of potassium and calcium to match. So sodium is largely the mover of that. Admittedly, it takes a little time to tolerate, to acclimate, plus additional water. But again, you're kind of foolproof to say, when you drink more water, like that's pretty much everybody's school nurse advice, and it's good. Yeah. And the other thing is iron. Especially among naturals, I don't know why. Actually, I think I do know why, but I won't go into why. And with naturals, I consistently see borderline, iron anemia, and it's simple fix. The good fix is testosterone. The bad fix, or the lesser good fix, is consume more red meat, potentially very dark brassicas, vegetables, and those are the two easiest and most almost no-brainer. Half the time I prepare that speech before I even open the blood work. Cool. I'm like, I got to tell this guy. I've been wrong a handful of times, and again, that's the beauty of the blood work, is it'll tell you. But those are two pretty straightforward ones. Is elevated sodium, especially if you see problems in the calcium, potassium. Sodium is the solution, and iron is iron, and it's pretty straightforward.
No, fantastic, and I think. I mean, you've just highlighted there about, I actually spoke to someone who looked over my work and with the calcium, and I spoke about how you suggested increasing sodium to raise the calcium. And I would have just said have more calcium. And so you've kind of just shown your expertise there, which I think is fantastic. And if people are interested in kind of delving into this thing, you've got your blood work done, I definitely would recommend personally going to Broderick, getting a consultation. I know have you got availability for that still?
I do, not an enormous amount, but I really try, especially when you and I do something, I try and make sure that I have at least a little bit of availability, because you're going to say exactly what you just said, and I like to live up to it. So yes, anyone out there who's interested, I will make the time for you. I will.
Awesome. And I mean, if you have got questions relating to the things that we've talked about, or if there's anything we haven't covered, then definitely put them below, and we will hopefully arrange another podcast where we can go over them. I've definitely got a few bits that I'd like to talk about with Broderick, but for now, I think we've spoken for a good amount of time. We've got a lot of good information out there. I'm sure you guys have found it super interesting, and I want to say a massive thank you to Broderick for coming on again. And I guess you guys will be very glad to see Broderick again, and to thank you guys for tuning in.